Warning. The following video contains strong language that some viewers may find offensive or disturbing.
Do you think video games should be discussed in school just like books and movies are? What games would be interesting to interpret or discuss as pieces of art and why? Alright guys, homework for tonight is Section 1 of Final Fantasy VI. For those of you who forgot what Section 1 is, you're going to play through until you reach the rebel base with Banon. Please don't play past that, as we don't want spoilers in the class. Get to Banon, save, then take a break. Single quote. My freshman year of high school, my AP World History teacher literally told us to play the early Assassin's Creed games. Best school assignment I ever got. You could have a specific class as an elective covering the basics of game design, gaming history, and gaming hardware advances, which likely is already studied under tech. Also could be used as supplementary literature material. Someone studying Atlas Shrugged, Brave New World, and 1984 would see how they influenced games like BioShock. BioShock also explores the concept of free will in a game setting where you appear to control the character, but ultimately you have to do whatever the game designers programmed your character to do. This is engagement with free will in a unique way that couldn't have been done in a movie or novel. You could discuss in a larger context, or in specific game study classes, but the story of books and movies don't require action from you to make happen. So they will be 100% easier to be looked at in school. So probably not in the context you're looking for. No. Yes, but I think pedagogy would be difficult. How do you expose students to the material? Games are usually machine-specific. They can be expensive, and they can take weeks to play through. But the storytelling is usually closely connected to the gameplay. So it would be difficult to say, here, read this synopsis of the main plot chain of Skyrim. Since it's not written like a novel, it would be incredibly boring for a lot of students, not to mention how to deal with necessary lore knowledge. There's incredible storytelling in games, and it's such a different experience from the storytelling in books. Like, I stopped reading most high fantasy years ago, but it's my preferred genre for games. I think there are so many aspects of video games that are worthy of academic attention in the humanities storytelling. Interactive engagement. How gameplay mechanics affect engagement. Dragon Age was in some ways a very different game on console versus PC, art, etc., etc., but you'd need to find a good way to have students experience them in order to do it on a large scale. Yes, how can you give students access to the hardware, software, and time needed to sufficiently engage with a game? I'm an art history professor who's been really interested in teaching a course about video games and art. But you simply can't have play at least X hours of Chrono Trigger as an assignment. Leaving aside the very, very significant challenge of giving everyone access to the game console. That's a very big ask in terms of homework when combined with other readings, writing assignments, etc. And if you're thinking, but I'd want to do that kind of homework. Playing games is fun. Well, I wish I could teleport you to my History of Comics course, where there was endless outrage about how long graphic novels were, and I was constantly finding myself saying stuff like, so, then, nobody read the Calvin and Hobbes strips I assigned? What about the Garfield packet? Basically, people engage with stuff differently when it's homework, both because, hopefully, they're thinking more actively, critically, and that's mentally taxing, but also because, in a more fundamental way, it's tough to get past a work equals bad mentality. Add to that the fact that getting to know a game takes time, and yeah, I'd be in for it. What I do these days is I just give my students a lot of freedom when it comes to choosing the topics for final research projects. This past semester, I had a handful who wrote about games, and I did my best to help them approach that material in a serious, scholarly way. So, even if I don't think I'm going to offer a course anytime soon, I still have the opportunity to guide and cultivate student curiosity on the topic. Some of them are, hopefully, going into the industry, so I figure it's my job to help them approach this material from a more critical, historical perspective. Plus, selfishly, It means I get to have a rich conversation with a student about, say, okami and gestural brushwork, which is a nice change of pace from the, oh, so you want to write about Duchamp, everyday routine. It would be interesting to see how that would be implemented. Maybe some snippets of dialogue similar to reading excerpts from books, plays. I think something like RDR2 would be interesting. There's a lot of potential for discussions about good, evil, and just plain morality and human nature in general. Unless it's an elective. No, as fun as that would be. Books and movies are easily accessible and cheaper compared to video games. Students would need a console or PC to begin with, plus the actual games, which can get pricey. I've integrated video games into my lessons with my high schoolers. I try to keep things relevant and in their circle of interest. It definitely stirs up some good discussions. Granted, not every student is into video games or play said games we talk about, but they can still relate to the topic at hand. I would explore the philosophy and ethics behind open world, RDR2, Elder Scrolls, etc. video games. In those games we chose to be either good or bad. Why do we make the decision? Is it a reflection of our own moral code or primal desire? It's kinda hard to discuss a video game in class. Not every kid has a PC or a console. Books are cheap enough to buy or just give them to the kids. And movies could be watched together in class. And games are usually too long to play in class together. I see it more as a specialty elective rather than a requirement. There are too many barriers. For example, financial, skill and time that wouldn't work for a high school class. Alternatively, some teachers allow you to discuss any sort of narrative, as long as you can defend it academically, which means video games could potentially be an essay topic for individual students. Greater than skill. I'm surprised that many comments don't acknowledge this as a barrier. Since this is a long-standing hobby for most people here, they forget that at one point they had to learn how to play. So if you wanted to use video games as a learning tool in school, you would first need classes just to teach kids how to play. I didn't play video games as a kid, so I'm pretty bad at them. My reflexes aren't trained for it. The buttons aren't intuitive for me, and I struggle to walk around in first-person games because the perspective and movement are separate controls. So it would basically be like telling kids to analyze a book when you never taught them all how to read. You can't really use games like this in a required class unless you had a class dedicated to the basic skills. It would have to be optional or part of an elective. Not really, since the barrier of entry costs a lot of money for a PC, Xbox, and games and whatever. Poor students would have trouble participating. Beyond that, the vast majority of video games, even the best, don't hold much academic merit beyond visual arts. And at that, rarely if ever beyond an 8th grade level. Some games teach skills or can help students to understand complex systems. But of those, how many are of a school-appropriate nature? And if you do manage to find a holy grail game that has both academic merit and teaches skills in an appropriate way, would it not just be better to find a cheaper alternative to the game in favor of reaching more students? I would say that video games as a whole would be discussed. And only games that defined genres would be talked about individually, such as Pong and Doom. I'd say yes. But not really. I think games could be on the same level as books or movies, and dissected the same way, but they're usually purposefully shallow. It's like having a class discussing blockbusters. Except worse, because that would probably be a great class. Focus on smaller indie games and you are no longer discussing blockbusters. Instead you get stronger, shorter narratives and usually a cool gameplay mechanic that is tied to the story that can be analyzed. I am a literature teacher and a gamer, and I think there are some absolutely valid ways to look at video games in a general sense and explore their themes and argue about what they say about our world. However, most of the books one explores in school are books about ideas, not books driven by plot. While many video games introduce some interesting ideas, most do not explore those ideas to a thorough extent. I'm going to be honest. I cannot think of a game that opens up societal discussion the way that certain books and movies do, the ones that are usually required reading and even the ones that do open discussion of these sorts of things. They would also need to be very user-friendly to be a good form of education. I did my senior thesis for undergrad on why video games, at least those of certain genres, should be considered for literary analysis. The games I used to make my point were the Legend of Zelda series. The storyline for which has many components borrowed from traditional folklore and the classic hero's journey format. I think that games with extensive lore, as well as those that are heavily text-driven in narrative, are viable for literary study, and offer learners a way to engage with traditional storytelling components in a format that might be more engaging. Particularly for tactile learners, there's a growing field of video game studies in academia, so I hope to see that begin to trickle down throughout the educational system in the coming years. Given the significant role that games play in many people's lives, there's no reason we shouldn't hold them to the same level of prestige as film and literature, and grant them the same critical and thoughtful examination. Interesting, but the stigma of video games and the price tags really hurt the odds. We need a millionaire, billionaire to invest in a business that creates a system to supply the means to use video games as teaching tools. Detroit Become Human would be a good game to teach. It's a story-driven game. So it's basically like a movie or book. However, in this game, you choose what the characters do and the choices they make. Meaning the class can shape the story, which would be really cool. The game is about a world where humanoid androids are used as our slaves pretty much. However, they were made so close to human that they begin to love, care, experience fear, etc. I think it would be amazing to have video game discussions as an art, not only about storytelling, but also about themes, meaning, cohesion and of course visuals. The problem is, this is school we're talking about. Using Half-Life 2 as an example, teenagers are not going to focus on the volumes Gordon Freeman's silence speaks throughout the story. How Alex develops a simultaneous trust bond with him and grief as they progress. The mysteriousness of the G-Man's dialogue or the massive butterfly effects one action has on the overall plot. They are gonna focus more on which gun is better at blowing a Combine soldier's head off. I'm not saying that this is a bad idea. I'm all for it. But I think that most children at that age don't process that kind of appreciation for the craft. I can see talks about video games as art on universities and college, where they can recognize aspects of beauty beyond gameplay, but in school it would be way more difficult. Besides, there's the hard task on grading the students based on what they learn, and what they interpret, and how may vary or not meet the criteria to constitute for a passing grade. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, and hit the notification button. See you next time.